Welcome, everyone, to a very, very special episode of Legends and Lectures. I'm here with a legend, especially in my own field, Dr. Francis Young. Thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Francis Young.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm very excited because I have your new book, and you have a new book, and I would love for you to tell us about Silence of the Gods. So, can you please give us yes, Dr. Francis is holding it up very kindly because we have no mail in Canada at the moment, and even though I have all of his digital books, I did not get the physical one in time. Thank you so much for holding it up. But please tell us what it's about.
So, Silence of the Gods is a book about the last peoples in Europe to accept the Christian faith. Those peoples who were at the geographical and cultural margins of the continent in many ways and were very reluctant to accept Christianity. And it's kind of catalogues their history from the 15th century right the way down to the beginning of the 20th century. And it begins in 1387 with the official conversion of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to Christianity, which is often portrayed as this moment when Christianity is triumphant. There are no more pre-Christian religions. It's no longer a factor in Europe's religious history. And really, the book kind of challenges that idea, and it traces how these people continue to exist. They continue to cling on to their traditions, but it also clarifies exactly how they did that.
So let's get ourselves established. So I will ask the forbidden question and ask you, please tell us, what is a pagan?
Yeah, so the subtitle of the book is The Untold History of Europe's Last Pagan Peoples. And the word pagan is one that I have mixed feelings about. Anyone who's read my books will be aware of this. On the one hand, it is a word that I do want to use because it's a word that I think is generally understood by the general public. It's a word understood by the general reader. When you say the word pagan, people have some kind of vague idea of what you're talking about. On the other hand, it's a word that a lot of academics don't want to use for very good reasons. And those reasons are, well, first of all, pagan is a word that was coined by Christians as a pejorative, as an insulting word for people who did not want to follow the Christian religion. So, on that basis, we might not want to use it. Pagan is also a very vague word. It's just one of those words which you use to label people who are not like you, and it's sort of a junkyard of all types of belief that are not Christianity. And from a conceptual point of view, that's perhaps not the best way to proceed in trying to get a handle on what people really believe, sort of throwing them into this category. But again, on the other hand, pagan is also a term which is used today by people who identify positively with pre-Christian religious traditions. So in the book, I kind of try to walk a bit of a tightrope on the use of this word. I think that there is a case to be made to say that there is a story to be told here of all these kind of disparate groups of people, some of them living in the far north of Europe, like the Sami, who are Finno-Ugric peoples, some of them living in the Volga-Ural region, right up against the far east edge of the European continent, up against the Ural Mountains in what's now Russia, and people in areas like the eastern Baltic coast. All these peoples totally different in terms of their language, their religious practices, their traditions, and yet there is a unifying factor, which is that all these peoples resisted Christianity, and their relationship with Christianity was different from all the other peoples of Europe who, in one way or another, come to accept Christianity. So I think there is a unified story to be told, and therefore that word pagan can be a useful one to have to describe all those peoples. But I actually prefer the term pre-Christian religions, religions plural, because these are people's very, very different traditions, very different approaches to the sacred. We can't lump them together. And we also have to bear in mind that their approaches to the sacred are far older than Christianity. They were developing potentially for upwards of 40,000 years before missionaries came along and wanted to impose Christianity on these people. So, yeah, I have mixed feelings about that word pagan. And I would definitely not use the word paganism, because paganism implies one single ideology or religion, which is pre-Christian. And of course, that's nonsense. There is no such thing. There are, potentially I might be willing to use the word paganisms, but certainly not a single paganism.
Yeah, it is, especially even when you hear, like, even in the neo-pagan sphere, people say things like, "I'm a pagan." You go, what does that mean? That there are so many different ideas of what that could be, and there is this sort of pervading idea, especially nowadays, that pagans are all just one thing, and it's the same thing. Always say you're a Christian. Well, are you Catholic? Are you Protestant? Are you that? So this idea of there being only this, as we say in the biblical sphere, univocality doesn't really exist. And it's kind of it takes away from really the richness of what was possibly there. You say, especially in your book, that it's every bit as unhistorical to project the attitudes and ideals of contemporary paganism back onto pre-Christian peoples. In the book, you use the word Christian-esque and pagan-esque. So can you define these ideas a bit for us?
A key idea in the book is that we need to discard this binary that there's often been between the idea that a culture is either Christian or pagan. And I'm not sure that that works very well when it comes to these peoples that I'm talking about. For example, the peoples of the Baltic, the peoples of the Volga-Ural region, the peoples of the far north of Fennoscandia. And the reason for that is that all these peoples came into contact with Christianity repeatedly and over a long period of time. That, by the way, is a key difference between these peoples and, for example, the peoples of the New World who come into contact with Christianity in this one traumatic event, this conquest event. It's not quite like that in these margins of Europe. So it's a continuous process of cultural encounter and exchange. And as a result of that, you end up with a rather peculiar religious situation where missionaries have effectively wiped out most of the memory of the original native traditions of these peoples, if you like, their pristine religious traditions they had before they encountered Christianity. And yet at the same time, the missionaries have not done enough work to make sure that these people are actually instructed in the Christian faith. So what we end up with is this kind of religious no man's land where the original traditions, the pagan traditions, if you want to call them that, have been eliminated, but the new has not yet come in. And so during this period, you end up with what I would describe as community religions or Creole religions. The comparison I would make is with Haitian religion in the Caribbean. So where you've got these traditions that have been composed out of Yoruba religion from Africa and Roman Catholicism, and yet they are too different from either Yoruba religion or Roman Catholicism to be considered deviant versions of either. In other words, we have a new religion. We have Haitian Vodou. So that's the kind of the paradigm of Creole religion that anthropologists will usually fall back on. Or indeed, practices from elsewhere in North America. But recently, there has been a move amongst scholars to focus on the idea that Creole religion might have existed in Europe. Now, so far, that's mainly been in the context of the Roman Empire. So scholars of antiquity and late antiquity have drawn attention to this possibility of Creole religions. As far as I know, I'm the first person to suggest it for the period from the 15th to the 19th century in the context of these marginal peoples in Eastern and Northern Europe. But it's the idea that people might take elements from Christianity and regard them as sources of sacred power. That's where this word Christian-esque comes in. So if, for example, I'm somebody who's living in 17th century Estonia, I might well have a bronze cross that either a missionary gave to me or one of my ancestors, or I acquired by trade. I have no real clear idea of what this means. However, I will know that the cross is something which is sacred to the Christians, and therefore it's a potential source of sacred power. And so I might then set that cross up in a personal shrine that I've created and worship it and perhaps offer sacrifices to it. And so you've got there elements of Christianity, but within a conceptual framework that is clearly not what we would describe as conventional Christianity. Or you get on the other side, you get the pagan-esque. So you get the idea of certain cultural practices that survive in a largely Christianized society, which imitate pagan behaviors, or perhaps are thought to be, whether truly or erroneously, to be in some way pagan. A good example of that would be in 17th century England, where you had quite a lot of people who were in rebellion against Puritanism and therefore would self-consciously engage in practices such as maypole dancing, which the Puritans believed were pagan. Now, they were in error in thinking that maypoles had anything to do with paganism in any substantial way. And yet some people who actually wanted to maypole dance would overtly kind of associate themselves with the idea of the maypole dance as pagan. And so it becomes a pagan-esque practice. So you get this kind of this weird mirroring, on both sides of the divide, which makes it very, very difficult to maintain that kind of binary between the pagan and the Christian.
And pagan-esque, of course, has absolutely nothing to do with Easter eggs. That's not pagan-esque.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's an example of the modern pagan-esque. So, when you'll get people who are absolutely insistent that Easter is a pagan festival and the Easter eggs were, part of some kind of imagined lost pagan festival and all that kind of stuff. That is, yeah, that's pagan-esque because it's not rooted in any actual pre-Christian practice, but it's a kind of an imagined pre-Christian reality.
Yes, I mean we know where Easter eggs come from, and as Dr. Young says, it's not that. But I find it interesting that when you're talking about Christianesque and paganisque, how would you define these? Would you really call these religions? And I ask this question because, religion, I would say it's a system of beliefs and rituals that people do. But so, for example, when you go to some place like Japan, and Shintoism obviously is one of their main religions. And if you ask Japanese people if they're religious, they say no, they're not. But then they have festivals, some festivals at certain times of the year. They even incorporate festivals like Christmas into their, obviously Christmas is a commercial holiday there. But they're very willing to pick and grab and even incorporate gods. I say gods with air quotes because gods like Billiken, who, if you look at Billiken, you think, oh, he's definitely Buddhist. And then when you understand where Billiken comes from, that he was made up in Milwaukee, but they're very glad to incorporate that into their pantheon. But even though we would see these things as religious figures, they don't really. So what would you term a religion in this context?
This is a tricky issue. And I think the reason why it is quite tricky is that, on one level, it's absolutely true that in societies where there is no clear differentiation between the sacred and the profane, in itself, of course, a Christian idea that there can be such a distinction between the sacred and the profane. It is true that people don't think of religion as a separate category. And, Japan would be a great example of that. On the other hand, I think the danger is that if we approach either past or present societies where such distinctions are not made, and we then refuse to make that distinction, the danger of that is that we negate the concept of religion within that society as something which is equal and equally worthy of value and equally worthy of analysis as the things which we are comfortable in calling religion. And what I mean by that is that we often approach religion as Westerners from a post-Christian cultural context in this mode of thinking of world religions. And world religions we will often think are only sort of worthy of that status if they are religions of confessionality, religions of scriptures, religions of self-identification, self-conscious self-identification. So the great proselytizing religions like Christianity and Islam, but also those religions that have established themselves either by an extended tradition of scripture like Judaism, or by identification with a particular national identity like Hinduism. We have this tendency to think those are the only proper religions, and there's only about 6 of them. And that's very problematic because what that does is it marginalizes what I have called the community religions or the Creole religions, religions which are just as worthy of study by scholars of religion or anthropologists of religion or sociologists of religion. And yet, they will often have a much more restricted and narrow community spread. So, for example, I've already mentioned the Creole religions of the Caribbean, um, or, for example, forms of Creole religion that existed in, you're based in Canada, in the Métis community,
Hmm.
where you've got indigenous peoples who are intermarrying with French settlers, creating these distinctive Creolized cultures. And those are very geographically marginalized. These are groups of people that are very hard to get to. They're groups of people who often don't write things down. And yet they are absolutely fascinating and just as interesting as any of these kind of great world religions. So, yeah, again, I kind of have mixed feelings about the use of the word religion, because on the one hand, yes, it is true. Religion can be a bit of a straitjacket. It can sort of force us into thinking that these cultures make a much clearer distinction between the religious and the non-religious than they really do. But on the other hand, if we don't use that word religion, then we're always in danger of kind of, writing this stuff off as somehow lesser than the religions that we're comfortable in talking about.
Yeah, you still hear all the time from people like, oh, Buddhism's not a religion, it's a philosophy. I would say China would beg to differ with you.
Yeah.
Speaking of this, so what would you consider to be a pagan survival, and what is a pagan survival not?
Or yeah, I mean, survival has for so long been the kind of the hermeneutic, the interpretative lens through which ideas of the pagan continuing in European society has been considered. What I mean by that is that if you look in 20th century scholarship, again and again, only the 19th century scholarship, again and again, you've got people asking this question: does anything survive? Does anything survive from that pre-Christian period? Has anything kind of gone underground and somehow, by some miracle, has it managed to, weather the persistent, weather the power of Christianity, and has it managed to survive in some way? And I think the difficulty with all these questions about survival is that they assume that a religion, a pre-Christian religion, can survive in a Christianized world, in a Christianized society in some sort of secret way. And then you get into the kind of the rather dodgy realms of secret societies that may or may not exist and may or may not have been, transmitting pagan ideas and so forth. And you get into the, the realms of the scholarship of Margaret Murray, which, whilst very colourful, it's not necessarily something which contemporary scholars would endorse. So yeah, I mean, what I have done, I mean, in another book which came out in 2024, which I co-wrote with Dr. Robin Douglas, a book called Paganism Persisting. We proposed an alternative hermeneutic for really understanding the re-emergence of the pagan idea in European society. And that is a hermeneutic of persistence rather than survival. And the difference is that survival implies some kind of genetic continuity. So when you say that, a pagan practice is a survival, that implies that there's kind of a chain of people who've been doing it or believing it, and in some way doing it consciously and understanding that what they were doing was in some way a pagan practice. Whereas persistence is a rather more diffuse idea. It allows for the idea that pagan practices, in particular pagan rituals, but also pagan beliefs like belief in the gods, could be revived at various different points along the timeline without there necessarily being any kind of genetic continuity. And of course, that is always possible in European culture because the classical heritage is always there. I was mentioning about how in another book, which is called Twilight of the Godlings, which is focused on Britain, I wrote about the potential that there could be some practices that are genuine survivals in the sense that there's continuity from prehistory. And one of those is, throwing bits of metalwork into bodies of water. That seems to be a distinctively British thing that, goes way, way back. But again, there isn't much that you can definitely say is, has got that sort of continuity. So in general, I don't like talking about survivals. I prefer to talk about revivals of a persisting idea. And those revivals are, pagan-esque or Christian-esque. They are commentaries very often on the idea of the pagan within a society and a society's kind of conscious awareness of its own pre-Christian heritage. And that doesn't negate them. That doesn't mean that they're not meaningful or important, but it means that we can't necessarily see them in any kind of straightforward way as being survivals.
It always interests me as to what people cherry pick as, oh, this looks like a survival or that doesn't. There's a new I say new. There's a custom of people now making lemon pigs at New Year's, and I think, and this obviously this is an Edwardian era thing that has just taken it. People find it interesting. People found the news clippings that talked about making these things. And people make the lemon pigs and they put it down at midnight and then you put some money in the pig. And I think it's interesting how if you look at that, you think to somebody who goes, "Oh, why wouldn't you choose that as a pig, as a pagan survival? You're carving something in an idolatric image and then you're putting money in it. And then you're leaving it for somebody to see or maybe for a god to look at or look at you favorably. So I think it's interesting that people pick and choose what is pagan and what isn't, and
Yeah,
how
oh,
people
absolutely.
yeah, how
Yeah.
people just decide this. So in your book, you talk specifically about the peoples who are considered to be the last pagans. So it's not obviously not only the Lithuanians, but there's the Sami, the Animist Estonians, the Balts, Finno-Ugric peoples. Can you tell us a little bit about all these different tribes?
So the book is focused on three main areas of Europe, which people who, well, even many Europeans, to be honest, are not that familiar with some of these areas. One of the areas that it's focused on is the Eastern Baltic. So that is today Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the Baltic states. The other area that it's focused on is northern Fennoscandia, an area which traditionally was known as Lapland, although scholars tend not to use that term anymore. We prefer the term Sapmi because that's the term that the Sami people use for themselves. And that's an area which covers several countries. So Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and part of Russia as well is in Sapmi. So it's an ethnographic region, but it is not in any single country. And then the third area that the book looks at is probably what's least familiar to Europeans and North Americans, which would be this area inside Russia, but right up against the Ural Mountains and next to, on the banks of the river Volga, which is this colossal river that flows through European Russia. And those people are not ethnic Russians. They are Finno-Ugric peoples, and they include the Maris, the Udmurts, the Chuvashes, the Mordvins, various other peoples who have a particular history of very late adoption of Christianity. And in terms of the religious traditions of these peoples, the Latvians and the Lithuanians go together as a group because they are speakers of Indo-European languages, Latvian and Lithuanian, which are Baltic languages. So in terms of their cultural closeness to other Europeans, they are the closest. So you can find commonalities in their religious practices that you could make a legitimate comparison with Slavic religion, for example, or even with Roman religion. There are some similarities there because you're dealing with a culture which is essentially Indo-European. But once we go to the Estonians, once we go to Finno-Ugric peoples, then we are dealing with traditions that are perhaps less familiar, that are based on sacred forests, on forms of shamanism, on the idea that you can transform yourself in trance into animals, which is part of the reason why werewolves are such a significant part of that culture. Once you get to the Sami, you're dealing with a very unfamiliar religious landscape, which has more in common with Siberian and North American shamanism than it does with other European expressions of pre-Christian religion. So you've got shamanic trances there, you've got sacred drums. And when you look at the people in Russia, so the Mordvins and the Maris and the Udmurts and so forth, you've got animist traditions that are based on hunting practices. So a relationship with nature as if nature and as if individual animals and trees within nature are treated as persons. So again, whether we use the word religion for that is controversial. Whether animism can even be considered a form of religion, that's a difficult question. But yeah, a great diversity of religious practices among these peoples. But all of them, the thing that they have in common is that they all were late adopters of Christianity and that Christianity made little headway within these societies.
How big was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania at this time?
The Grand Duchy of Lithuania is absolutely huge during most of its existence. It exists between 1253, when it's founded by King Mindaugas, who's the first and only king of Lithuania. Subsequently, its rulers are known as Grand Dukes, hence Grand Duchy, and its final dissolution in 1795, when it's partitioned between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia and the Russian Empire. So it exists for a good long time. And it's huge because it stretches all the way from the Baltic Sea right the way almost to the Black Sea. So it covers the area that is, broadly speaking, today's Latvia and Lithuania, today's Belarus, large parts, basically the western half of what's now Ukraine, and also bits of what's now European Russia. So it's the largest state in late medieval Europe, largest state in early modern Europe. It becomes even larger because it enters into a dynastic and political union with Poland, which is formalized in 1569, the Union of Lublin. So it ends up as something called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Even though the Grand Duchy still continues to exist as a separate independent state, it's federated with Poland as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So it's an enormous state.
Let's talk about the Great Conversion of 1387. And did people make it sound like that happened overnight, but did it really happen overnight?
So Lithuania is the last country in Europe to become Christianized. And that's important because it was a country that was caught between two different varieties of Christianity and indeed the Islamic world as well. So in terms of its geographical location, to the west of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania is located Catholic Poland and the Catholic Teutonic Knights, who are a crusading order of German knights whose purpose is to try and conquer Lithuania and convert it to Christianity, which they never succeed in doing. To the east, you've got Muscovy, which is a growing Orthodox power, Orthodox Christian power. And then to the south, you've got the Crimean Khanate, which is a Muslim power. So the Grand Dukes of Lithuania basically find themselves in this situation where they're caught between some of the world's great religions, and their strategy for ensuring their political autonomy is to remain religiously autonomous. So that's one of the reasons why they stay pagan. They decide, well, if we go along with any one of these religions of our neighbors, that means that we will ally ourselves, we'll be tied into a political alliance with them, and they don't want to do that. And particularly, they do not want to submit to Catholicism because of the Teutonic Knights who are trying to conquer them. They do not want to submit to Orthodoxy because the Muscovites are their greatest kind of enemies. The Protean enemy of the Lithuanians is the Russians or the Muscovites, as they are at this time. And they're also not that interested in Islam. So what happens is that in 1385, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, a guy called Jogaila, he receives an offer he can't refuse. And that is that the King of Poland has died, leaving behind a daughter. The nobility of Poland, being misogynistic men of the late 14th century, do not believe that a woman is capable of ruling Poland. And so they are looking for a husband who can become king of Poland. Jogaila decides, well, this is a great offer because what it means is that I can become king of Poland and unite Lithuania and Poland in a dynastic union. The great thing is that the Poles, although they are Catholics, hate the Teutonic Knights and the Muscovites as much as we do. So it was a kind of an enemy's enemy is my friend kind of situation. So he decides, right, I'm going to accept baptism. I'm going to marry Jadwiga, who is she has the title of King of Poland, confusingly, even though she's a woman. He marries Jadwiga, converts to Catholicism, but the quid pro quo is that he's got to then convert his own territory of Lithuania to Catholicism. So he organizes this great big set piece event in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, in 1387, 14th of February, 1387. He turns up with a load of white robes made of wool and says, anyone who comes to Vilnius on this day, I will give you one of these valuable woolen white robes if you agree to baptism. He brings along a load of Polish priests. The Polish priests don't speak a word of Lithuanian. So Jogala has to do the preaching in Lithuanian and say what the Polish priests are saying. And basically, they go around with these great big aspergillia, which is these kind of holy water shakers. They gather the people into big squares where you've got a square of men and a square of women, and they shake the holy water shaker and say, everyone in this square, your name is John. Everyone in this square, your name is now Catherine. I baptize you. And so they end up being baptized, but they end up not understanding anything about this new religion into which they're being baptized. And of course, there are only a few hundred people who come in from the local countryside. The vast mass of the Lithuanians do not understand what's happened. They don't understand Christianity. And yet they are now kind of classed as being officially within Latin Christendom. They belong now to the Catholic Church. But the trouble is that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when it comes into being, it doesn't have any kind of centralized religious policy. And that's because it's an essentially democratic state. It's actually a republic, which is weird because it has a king and a grand duke. But it is a republic because it's ruled by a convention of the nobility known as the Sejm, the parliament. And everything has to be agreed. Famously, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is very, very divided. And it's kind of crazy. Everything has to be debated in parliament. And they all follow different religions. So, there are, some Orthodox members of the Sejm, there are some Catholic, some are Polish, some are Lithuanian, some are Belarusian. There are even some Jewish nobility in the Grand Duchy. So you end up with a situation where it is impossible for the Grand Duchy to enforce a religious policy. That means that unlike most other European states, the monarch cannot say everyone must follow my religion. So it makes it an incredible safe haven for pagans. So if you're a pagan in Lithuania, basically nothing's going to happen to you. The state is not going to do anything to force you to become Christian. But on the other hand, the church is interested in converting you. So, groups of missionaries will go out and they have no power to compel people, to become Christians, but they will, constantly be going out every single summer to try and persuade people.
But this was not the first attempt that was made in 1387. There were previous attempts to Christianize this region. Can you talk about some of those attempts and why they failed?
Yeah. So basically, in 1226, a guy called Conrad of Mazovia, who was a Polish duke, invited this group of military monks, the Teutonic Knights, to come and move into his territory and try and conquer another Baltic people called the Prussians. Not to be confused with the German-speaking Prussians of later centuries. These are the original Baltic pagan Prussians, which they successfully do. But the thing about the Teutonic Knights is that they basically establish this military monastic state for their own self-interest. They don't really pay much attention to converting Prussians, because if they do, the Prussians will have rights. If they're Christians, they will have rights. But if they're non-Christians, they can kind of constitute this slave class who don't really have any rights. And so it's a kind of an irony of crusade, especially in Northern Europe, the Northern Crusades, that actually the purpose of crusade wasn't to convert people. The purpose of crusade was to capture the territory of non-Christian people, because crusaders could claim the right to it and take it as their own. But then once they'd captured that territory, they would keep these non-Christians in a state of subservience and not convert them to Christianity. And that also happened in Latvia and Estonia. And so you end up with these principalities, these monastic military states, one belonging to the Livonian Sword Brethren, the other belonging to the Teutonic Knights, that are full of pagans. And you constantly get rebellions, throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, where people are trying to overthrow their oppressors and, trying to recover their pre-Christian religion. And will try and kill the Christians whenever they get the chance to do it. So these attempts are clearly not successful. You also get an attempt to convert Lithuania by persuading King Mindaugas, who's the guy who basically founds the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, to become a Christian, which he does. He does agree to become a Christian, but that doesn't really work because he tries to give up territory then to the Teutonic Knights. He is killed by his own nobles who assassinate him, and they revert to paganism, in a big way. And so that doesn't work. You get friars who travel to Lithuania and try and convert people. But while, Gediminas, who's one of the Lithuanian Grand Dukes, he has this very liberal, tolerant religious policy where, he's happy for friars and Orthodox monks and, Jewish rabbis and Islamic imams, all these people to coexist alongside his pagan population. He has this strict rule: you're not allowed to try and convert anybody. And if you do, I will put you to death. So whenever that happens, these friars get sent back as, a collection of body parts, because he is not keen on this idea of conversion. So it doesn't really work. And part of the reason that conversion doesn't work is that it is such a tolerant country. It has this extraordinary experiment with religious toleration going on, which means that, attempts at conversion are not successful because people just say, well, why should I convert? I can follow any religion I want, and nobody is going to punish me for doing so.
So what practices were actually going on in the Grand Duchy? What was happening in Vilnius? How much of what the Teutonic Knights and later post-Christian authors wrote about these pagan Baltics, what was actually true that was actually going on?
Yeah, this is a tricky question because we have basically two phases of writing about Baltic paganism. The first phase is stuff that the Crusaders wrote down, and they only had a very vague idea about what was happening. And the reason for that is that they were writing behind a military frontier. So the idea that there was any kind of, cultural interaction going on, it was just very, very limited. They were kind of guessing and imagining what these pagans might be like. And so they came at this with these kind of barbaric stereotypes of pagans as people who, must be conducting human sacrifice. They must be engaging in incest. They must be, burning virgins alive and all this kind of stuff, which is so stereotyped. It's clear that, this is taken from the, fevered imaginations of these chroniclers. But then you pass into this post-conversion period when you do have missionaries who are traveling into these areas. And some of them, because by this time, this is the 15th century, the Renaissance is dawning. These are people who, in some cases, are actual humanist scholars who are genuinely curious about the concept of human religiosity. And so you get this second wave of writing about Baltic pagans, which is really genuinely curious. And I wrote a book about this, which is a collection of translations of these documents called Pagans in the Early Modern Baltic, because I was absolutely fascinated by how curious they were. And yes, they were Christians. They were looking at everything through a Christian lens. They still wanted to convert these people to Christianity, but they also did approach these religions with genuine curiosity. And so I think we can put some weight on those later sources. They are flawed sources, to be sure, but they are at the same time, they're motivated by curiosity. And some of these people did genuinely travel to the region and write about it. And I think there are also some sources which talk about the pre-Christian era because they were written down either at the time of conversion or shortly after. And they, for example, describe a temple in Vilnius. Ironically, the temple had once been a cathedral because Mindaugas built a Christian cathedral, which after his assassination later gets turned into a temple to Perkunas, who's the thunder god of the Balts. And so the roof is taken off it because the Balts don't believe that a temple should have a roof. It's open to the elements. It contains a seven-sided altar, which is on high steps, and that's where sacrifices are made to Perkunas, and you have statues of various gods and goddesses in niches, reportedly. And that seems to be unique to Vilnius. So only in Vilnius is there a temple. Elsewhere, people seem to worship in groves. Cremation is very, very, very important. You get an area called a Šventaragis, which is where the dead will be cremated, and then they will practice cremation burials. So a tumulus will effectively be constructed over where the cremation burial had taken place, and the dead will then be fed at various points throughout the year, where people will come and conduct a feast and will pour libations into the ground and hold these banquets in honor of the dead, at which the dead are believed to come back and feast at. And, we have good evidence for domestic cults, where people have set up these shrines inside their houses and granaries and things like that. We have good evidence for the cults of sort of forest dwelling spirits. But, this is the sort of stuff you would expect to survive longer than the cult of major deities. In terms of major deities, we have the cult of Perkunas, which really kind of survives right into the 19th century in some cases, and Gemina, who is the goddess of the earth, who continues to be worshipped right the way through. But other deities, they're rather shadowy. We've lost contact with them, I think, because they were perhaps, the deities of the celestial realm who are the first to go in the process of Christianization. It tends to be that when Christianity arrives, the celestial deities get displaced. But the chthonic deities, the deities of the earth, under the earth, deities of the forest, deities of the home and hearth, they carry on for much, much longer.
You mentioned Ievas in the book, so the Baltic sky god, and so
Yeah,
did he become a sort of stand-in for a Christian god? Did he get confused with Jesus? Did they make a sort of Christian-esque aspect of it at one point?
it's a really difficult question because we do have these references to dievas in, for example, dainas, which are these 19th century songs. They may be much older than the 19th century, but they were collected in the 19th century. And they're traditional songs, mostly from Latvia, but sometimes from Lithuania, that talk about a kind of celestial divine family or pantheon. Perkunas is the main character usually in the Dainas. He's the thunder god. But there is said to be this other sort of celestial god who is behind Perkunas, who's known as Dievas. Now, the word Dievas in Lithuanian, Dievs in Latvian, it just means God. It's cognate with Deus and Theos, in Latin and Greek. So it's a classic Indo-European word. Does Dievas refer to a specific pagan divine personality who existed before Christianity? Or is Dievas a kind of Christian-esque construction in that he is the concept of the Christian God that people who had a very poor or non-existent understanding of Christianity had? And I don't know the answer to that question. My own feeling, however, is that it's probably safer to assume that Dievas is a kind of Christian-esque character who emerges from contact between Baltic religion and Christianity. And the reason I say that is that there are a few of the Dainas where Dievas and Perkunas are actually confused. And so that suggests to me that Perkunas is the original, sky god. But those aspects of Perkunas that can't be reconciled to the Christian god, they stay as Perkunas, as a distinct character. Whereas those aspects that, can be reconciled to the Christian god, they get transmuted into Dievas. So yeah, I think that probably we're looking at some kind of Christian-esque figure.
What can we say, especially when we talk about this region, if any, is there any kind of surviving pagan aspect? And not a reconstructionist, but is there anything, because many, as you say, as you talk about in the book, uh, these ideas sort of last up until the 18th century. So what has lasted that long as a pagan aspect of their religion?
I think that elements of the pre-Christian culture of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, for example, has survived, but not perhaps in the way that people think. People will often look to the revivalist native religious movements of these countries, which you've got Romova in Lithuania, you've got Dievturi in Latvia, you've got the Masuled movement in Estonia. These are 20th century revivalist movements that are as much about kind of inventing a new religion that's sort of inspired by elements of the pre-Christian past as they are, survivals. They're not survivals, but there are survivals, and I would say that they are in places that you might not necessarily look. So to take an example, just yesterday, I saw on social media somebody had posted this extraordinary photograph of an Estonian supermarket where it had been built on the site of a glacial erratic stone, one of these giant boulders that are found throughout the Baltic states. And the supermarket had just been built around it, and a space had been made in the supermarket for this giant stone. And that, to me, that is a more powerful reminder of the significance of sacred nature within Estonian culture than any kind of revivalist movement, because that indicates this kind of reverence for nature, which is rather extraordinary and not found elsewhere in Europe. Or, for example, in Lithuania, any time somebody proposes to cut down an ancient tree, or there is, an unscheduled cutting down of an ancient tree, there will be national protests. At a national level, you have vigils where people will turn up and they'll carry candles for the dead tree. And it's not explicitly religious. Nobody is saying this is pagan. Nobody is self-consciously doing this as pagan. And yet it reflects this strange kind of connection with the natural world. Another example, many Lithuanians were taken by Stalin, forcibly exiled to various parts of the Soviet Union and died there. And after independence in 1990, an entire commission was set up by Lithuania whose purpose was to repatriate the mortal remains of every single Lithuanian who died outside of Lithuania during that period. And this was conducted not as a religious exercise, but as a sort of a national campaign. And yet no other nation was preoccupied with this idea. But when you look at the sources for pre-Christian Lithuanian religion, you come across this idea that it is extremely important that people are buried in their native earth, because the native earth is Gemina, is the earth goddess. This profound connection with the earth, and the belief that the dead must be buried in the earth because otherwise they cannot return in order to feast with the living at these various times of the year. And so while none of these ideas are explicitly advocated by this commission, the idea that the Lithuanians are so preoccupied with getting mortal remains back in their native earth, I think is a survival. It is a kind of a cultural echo of these deep, deep ideas, which makes, Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia kind of unique among European countries in this regard. And then when you go further to the east, and you go to the Udmurts and the Maoris, whilst there were elements of revivalism in the 19th century, where the Udmurts and Maoris were trying to self-consciously revive their animist traditions, I think it's impossible to say that they ever died out. There is also elements of continuity. So I think if you want to look for, pre-Christian religions in Europe that never died out, then the Volga-Ural region would be the place to look. The Mariel Republic, as it's known within the Russian Federation, it is a place where those traditions are very, very active. And, probably Estonia is the one country in Europe where it is most culturally acceptable to identify yourself as pagan. So, many Estonians will self-identify as pagan. And part of the reason for that is that no particular branch of Christianity ever managed to dominate Estonia. So you've got a whole religious mix. It's not a very devout country, in contrast to Lithuania, which is still a deeply Catholic country. And then when it comes to the Sami people, I think there you've got a kind of coexistence of animist traditions alongside Lutheran Christianity in quite a comfortable way. I've spoken to Sami people who've said, I'm Lutheran, I'm Christian, I identify as being Lutheran. I worship in, the Church of Sweden or the Church of Norway. But when I go past a sacred site, when I go past one of these sites known as siedis in the Sami language, which are these sacred outcrops of rock or something like that, I know that I mustn't camp there. I know that I mustn't leave rubbish there. I know that I mustn't use certain language there. So these kind of things persist. And that's kind of an undercurrent, which is so deep, it kind of runs under the radar of religion.
Interesting that you say that Estonia had that people there are quite happily identifying as pagan, and yet they have many types of Christianity, but nobody seems to be willing to point the finger at the other and saying, no, you're not a Christian, no, you're not a pagan, no, etc. Why do you think it is that in certain, I guess, in certain parts of our society, having written this book and knowing now what you know, why do you think it is that certain parts of Western society absolutely needs to believe in things like pagan survivals? Why is it that certain parts of Western society just can't let things go and say, no, this is Reconstructionist, or in Estonia, no, maybe it is pagan, maybe it's not. It doesn't matter. Why is it that some people just can't just let go of the rope?
I think it's mainly because in a post-Christian society, there's quite a lot of discomfort with recognizing the fact that our religious heritage is mostly Christian in Europe. Obviously there are exceptions to that, very important exceptions to that, such as Judaism and Islam in places like the Balkans and Spain. But broadly speaking, when you look at the religious past of Europe, you're looking at a kind of a deep well of Christianity, and that makes people uncomfortable because, especially if they're living in a society where modernity seems conditional on the rejection of Christianity. I give Ireland as an example of that, where in modern Irish culture, there's a feeling that Ireland can't be modern unless it rejects its Catholic heritage. Now, whether that's right or wrong, that has led a lot of people to a great sort of desire to see their heritage as something as not something that's not Christian, and therefore a kind of an attempt to recover an imagined paganism. Now, Ireland has not been pagan since the 5th century. So the idea that very much survives of pagan Irish culture is problematic, to say the least. Um, in countries like Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, the pagan past is much closer, in historical terms. But it's still true to say that these are countries which were eventually Christianized, and Lithuania, for example, Catholicism is profoundly important in Lithuanian history and in the history of, resistance to Russian and then Soviet occupation, for example. So, Catholicism is big. Even if you're not Catholic, Catholicism is a big part of your history. But I think that there is a sense in which people living in a post-Christian society aren't always comfortable with the idea of a completely secular outlook. And if you're not comfortable with a completely secular outlook, and you're not comfortable with Christianity as your religious heritage, but you're also not comfortable identifying with an Eastern religion, like all the people who buy into various forms of Buddhist spirituality, for example, the option that you have, the option that people like Gerald Gardner and Margaret Murray presented people with in the 20th century, is this idea that you might be able to self-identify as pagan and you might be able to hark back to these earlier traditions. But the problem that that creates is, how much information do we actually have about the pagan traditions of Europe? How much do we really know? And in most cases, the answer is almost nothing, because we have archaeological evidence, but archaeology does not preserve belief. With the best will in the world, we can excavate a shrine, we can excavate religious artifacts that were probably religious, but we can't ever say with certainty what they were used for. So it's only in the Greco-Roman world, and to some extent in the Scandinavian world, if you believe Snorri Sturluson, that we have evidence for what people actually believed. Everywhere else, we're left with this kind of scattered testimony of ethnographers and chroniclers and a bit of archaeology here and a bit there. And of course, we are left with the evidence of folklore in countries like the Baltic states, where pagan traditions lasted for a lot longer. And therefore, people tend to put more faith in folklore and say, folklore does preserve some kind of pagan traditions. But does it? That's the question. So yeah, there's always this problem of reconstruction.
Yes, every time I hear people say, "Oh, yes, but folklore," I go, "Let's not get into Sir James Fraser at the moment, please." I have many bones to pick with him, Margaret Murray, and especially Lady Raglan, and I have a very big bee in my bonnet about the Green. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, we could go on forever about that because I have a feeling that you and I would. So, but Silence of the Gods: The Untold History of Europe's Last Pagan Peoples. If you could hold the book up one more time, Dr. Young.
There it is.
Out by Cambridge University Press. Please get it. I loved this book. I loved your last book about the fairies, and I would love to have you back to talk about that one, because I think that's incredibly interesting. So thank you so much for being here, for giving us so much of your time. And I hope everybody goes out and buy this book because this book is absolutely fantastic. As all of your books are. I have read so many of them, and I'm so thrilled that you actually agreed to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.